All right. So picking up where we left off last time, we had talked about C# quite a bit last time, and how that was Microsoft's retort to losing the lawsuit against Sun Microsystems. They came back and created their own language that was looked a lot like Java, um, almost because it had to, because they're both based off of C++. It's this slide right here. Um, and it was platform independent as long as you were running Windows, but that had more to do with the fact that Microsoft doesn't want to share the .NET component architecture because they're in the business of gaining new users to use their operating system, not to let people write software for other people's operating systems. Okay, and this was really supported strongly out of the idea that you can have a Mac that runs Windows, and a lot of people who have Macs also have to run Windows for certain applications. So more of a little deceit type statement than really a problem type statement. So C#, good language, and that kind of led us here with this idea of the big three. That's my name for them. So in modern computer science, we have three major languages that are used throughout the industry: Java, C#, and Objective-C. So we're going to try to give some meaning to each of these as to what they are the right tool for. We could probably throw in another language here. We could probably throw PHP in there and just say web. It's fair enough to say that a lot of dynamic websites today are written in PHP. C# is actually part of the .NET suite, which actually has a product in it called ASP.NET, which will be a competitor with PHP. Just to kind of give you the quick 5-minute rundown of that. In terms of web servers on the internet right now, if you go to any website, chances are that website is either being run on Apache or it's being run on IIS, which is Internet Information Server, which is by Microsoft. Okay, these are the two competitors for web servers out there. So if you're a web developer and you're writing software for a web server, probably most of the internet is Apache, but it's probably losing some ground to IIS. Maybe it's 60-40 right now, 60% Apache, 40% IIS. But the punchline here related to the other slide would be, if you're programming for an Apache server, you're using PHP. If you're programming for an IIS server, you might be using PHP, but you're probably using ASP.NET. And the big reason for that is ASP.NET is written using Microsoft's tool called Visual Studio, which allows a programmer to visually design apps and websites. So, powerful tool. So if you are designing your website for a Microsoft based web server, it would probably be in your best interest to use Visual Studio to do that, because it gives you the most power. And part of that is because IIS has the .NET component architecture built into it, and it only runs on Windows. Okay. Apache will run on Windows. Nobody runs Apache on Windows. If your web server is a Windows server, you're going to run IIS. If your web server is not a Windows machine, it's probably running Linux, a Unix-based operating system. PHP will be the core dynamic language for it. So if you break off web programming into another category, then it doesn't belong in this big three list. But if we keep it in there, we could say PHP is certainly one of the big three, even though I have 4 things listed here. Okay, but when I say big three, I'm really talking about our high-level languages for writing non-native web applications. So let's talk about each of these and what kinds of apps they're built for writing, because all three of these exist, and there is some overlap. They are competitors with each other, but each one kind of has its niche. Objective-C is easy. If you're writing Mac software or iPhone/iPad software, you're going to use Objective-C. Done. That's the end of the road. Okay, if you're not writing those things, you're not going to use Objective-C unless you're like a hobbyist or something. It's not the right tool for the job. You will not be writing Objective-C based programs to run natively on Windows. Wouldn't make sense. Okay, so Objective-C is the Mac and iPhone, iPad language. Okay, C#, native Windows applications. Okay, and just to give you a little more explanation here, when I say C#, what I'm really saying is .NET, and what I'm really saying is languages supported by Visual Studio. And that's kind of an important distinction because Visual Studio is this, it's called an integrated development environment, an IDE. So it's a text editor on steroids that gives us power tools for writing software. Well, under Visual Studio, several languages are supported. We talked last time about one of those old languages was a language called J++, and then they had the brief opportunity to rename that J# once they went to the sharp stuff. If you look at this, you see how C# is really just the two pluses pushed together. So that's why they called it C#. But in any case, somewhere in there they had a J#, and that was kind of during the lawsuit, but all those died off because they lost the lawsuit. But in any case, in Visual Studio, we have support for C++, Visual C++, which is kind of Microsoft's version of C++, which is still used today for a lot of game programming. You have support for C#, you have support for Visual Basic, another language you may have heard of, and then you also have support for ASP, ASP.NET. So really 4 languages in there. Now, because all of the .NET languages work this way, that is, the top level language, in this case, our example was C#, but I could put Visual Basic in here instead of C#. And it goes through the .NET compiler, turns into Microsoft Intermediate Language, is compiled at runtime using a just-in-time compiler to run natively on the CPU. That makes sense? So I say C# right here because that's considered to be Microsoft's modern professional language that I put into the list of the big 3. But Visual Basic's been around for a long time. Most of you have probably at least heard of Visual Basic. Visual Basic was originally developed as a rapid application development tool. So the perks of Visual Basic is you have a lot of kind of hybrid office workers who are trained in one skill set, but could be a programmer if they decided to put their mind to it. Visual Basic kind of sits in the middle there, and it lets them pull off some programming-like tasks or write some quick business application type stuff for internal use only, let's say, because you're not going to probably create real professional, professional is not probably the right word, real polished looking applications. They're going to be functional applications that do what the business needs them to do, but it's really going to be for the internal workers of the business, not something you'd see being sold out on the shelves of Best Buy or something like that. You wouldn't see applications written in Visual Basic for that. But the Visual Basic tool was built to allow normal non-programmers, but working in the business industry, to create business applications that their business could leverage to make life easier for them, that kind of stuff. Okay, so Visual Basic is that kind of language. J++ was in there, ASP.NET, Microsoft Visual C++. So if you're a old school C++ programmer, you might be writing Visual C++ stuff. So if I'm going to just expand this a little bit, we might say VB source, Visual Basic. Or Visual C++ source. And we can throw ASP in there as well, but this will help me explain the example here. So as a .NET developer who's using Visual Studio as their tool, I can write code using any of these three languages because they all compile to Microsoft Intermediate Language. And there's an interesting caveat with that that maybe isn't taken advantage of that often, but for specific situations could be helpful. And that is, let's say that a portion of your project, maybe you're writing a game, okay, and some of the core components of the game, the parts of it that need to be really fast, would really benefit from C++ code. You can write that portion of the project in C++. And let's say that another aspect of it, maybe it's the login system and the account management stuff that's not really considered to be high performance. Like if you're a gamer, you never brag about how quick the user creation screens run, right? That's not part of the game. The game is the explosions and that kind of stuff. So when you're writing the user creation or the login screens, that kind of stuff, maybe C# makes more sense because this is a more modern language. So what I'm saying is if you're working on that game, you can create all those screens using C#. You can create all the gaming portions using C++. And if you really want to get crazy with it and you come up with some interesting use for Visual Basic, you could write some portion of it in Visual Basic as well. So your application is actually written in 3 different languages, but they all compile to Microsoft Intermediate Language because that's how the .NET component architecture works. Okay? So interesting perk of writing software under Microsoft's tool, which is Visual Studio. Probably a fair statement to say that Visual Studio historically has been the industry leader as an integrated development environment. So think of Visual Studio as being equivalent to like Microsoft Office, okay, but for programmers. Where on the Mac, the Macintosh tool that's equivalent to Visual Studio is a tool called Xcode. And the Macintosh equivalent of Microsoft Office would be iWork. They have a package called iWork, which gives you pages, numbers. Pages is like Word, numbers is like Excel, and then Keynote, which is what I use here, is like PowerPoint. Okay, so Apple's version of this, Objective-C, uses an IDE called Xcode. C# uses an IDE called Visual Studio. Java uses an IDE called Eclipse. There's actually several Java IDEs. The whole platform independence thing kind of opens it up to that, but the industry standard is Eclipse, which I think I probably have running on here. Yeah, here's Eclipse. So this is Java's IDE. Okay, so that's the tool you'd use to write those programs. Reality is, you could write any of these languages in just a text editor. But nobody does that anymore. And one of the reasons, I can just give you a quick example of that, is text editors won't do this. Let's say I'm going to create a string, and then I say s dot. It gives me a whole list of completion stuff, so I don't have to make sure I spell stuff correctly and things like that. So if I want to get the length of that string, I could just say s dot length like that, and I didn't have to risk forgetting the n or something like that in my typing. So it gives you some editing tools that allow programmers to maybe make less mistakes. And it does some indentation stuff for you and that kind of crap to make your life a little easier. Not a real great reason to use a standard text editor when you have tools like this freely available. Eclipse is 100% free. Xcode used to cost, now it's free. And Visual Studio also used to cost. Now they have a non-professional version that's free. Their professional version has a cost, but what you're really paying for there is collaboration tools. So if you are on a team with 20 developers, there's stuff built into it for you and those 19 other developers to kind of work hand in hand without screwing each other's projects up, that kind of stuff. So the free version of Visual Studio has all the features in it, outside of that the professional one has. So you're not like using a dumbed down version or something like that. All right. Now, in our world in here, again, I told you I'd point out what I feel is important. I'll probably never ask you, what's the IDE used for Java? What's the IDE used for C#? What's the IDE used for Objective-C? This is more informational, just so you can kind of see the picture of this world. Okay, the pieces of software you use for this stuff. When you get into our 250 class and we start writing a lot of Java programs, you'll use Eclipse and you'll become very familiar with it at that point. Okay, so this is more just filling in some of the gaps. Something I usually do before our exams, we have a midterm and a final in here. We usually spend one day where I kind of go through the slide set and tell you, because I usually don't write the exams like the night before or the morning of the exam. I'll go through and kind of out loud tell you which things I think are important and which things I wouldn't spend your time studying. You know, my job at the end of the semester is to give you a grade based on how well you've mastered the material that I deem to be important, not how well you guessed at what I was going to ask. Make sense? So you'll have a pretty good idea on what I think is important and what I don't. So I'm giving you a lot of information about some things, some of which are more, you might come in handy if you're ever on one of those game shows where it has like a trivia question about something obscure. So I was watching the Who Wants to Be a Millionaire show last night. My wife and I, usually it's on at the same time we're eating dinner pretty often. And this guy was on the $500,000 question and totally got it wrong. Why wouldn't he just walk with the cash? I never understand that. Like, and he had like a weird twitch and stuff. That guy shouldn't have been cleared to be on the show. So, in any case, so these are the tools we use to write those pieces of software. But bottom line is Objective-C, Mac and iPhone stuff. C#, Windows native applications, or web stuff if you're writing for Internet Information Server. Okay, cool tool. And I was saying before, I would say historically Visual Studio has been the industry standard for IDEs. It's the one that's been out the longest. So Microsoft has had Visual Studio. I think last time I was telling you about when I was at Microsoft's announcement of C# at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. They were handing out Visual Studio Professional. This was before they had the free version of it. Way before they had the free version. But they were handing out boxes that had like $600 street value or something. Microsoft has been in the business of having programming developer tool where these other ones are much more recent. Eclipse did not come out when Java came out. Eclipse came out years later and really was the evolution of several other ones that didn't work that well. For example, if you go to Java's main website, their recommendation for their IDE is something called NetBeans. NetBeans is their tool that they think you should use for Java stuff. Eclipse is the industry standard. Any place you go that you'll be doing Java, you'll be using Eclipse. In Objective-C, Xcode your only tool. All right, so Objective-C, Mac or iPhone, C#, Windows applications. So now Java. Java is really the more interesting discussion here. Because by all measures, Java probably should have died by now. Okay, and there's only a couple of reasons why I think it's still around. Now, Java's a really good language from a programming languages perspective. Java is also excellent for a teaching language, not because the language itself is superior in any way to C#. I would say they're basically equivalents. From a teacher's perspective, though, what I like about Java is I don't have to worry about what kind of machines you have. You know, whether you're a Mac or a PC user, you can write your Java code. Eclipse is written in Java, so it's available for both platforms. If you're a Linux user, you can get Eclipse in Java. I don't have to manage multiple different pieces of software running on different tools, or I don't have to require half of you to come into the lab down there to do your work. Does that make sense? Okay, and that's actually kind of an interesting connection to what we do in this particular class where we use this tool called Gamesalad. Gamesalad was a tool originally written for the Mac. So it's on all our machines down there in that lab. There is a Windows version of Gamesalad, so you can do your homework at home. It's pretty good, but it is more primitive than the Macintosh one. So Using it on the Mac is probably a better end experience, but any of the stuff we do in here, you can pull off on the Windows one. Okay, so but you're not dealing with equivalent tools probably. Where Eclipse is the same product whether you're on a Mac or a PC or Linux. Okay, and part of that is I'm pretty sure that since Gamesalad originally came out for the Mac, it was originally written in Objective-C. So when they moved it over to Windows, they had to start with a brand new product. I'm sure it's written in C# for the Windows side. Well, they had to start from scratch and port it over as a brand new product. So it wasn't based off of the original. It was loosely based off of the original. All right, so back to Java. So Java has this IDE Eclipse. Now, what's it actually used for? Well, we could certainly write Windows applications for Java. We would probably, if we have a need for a platform independent app, Java would be the right tool. Now that sounds great on paper, but the reality is, so that's if we're going to write an app and we want it to work on both Windows and Mac. Let's just say that covers most of our operating systems. That sounds great on paper, but how often is that really that important? We already covered in here, since Java is relatively slow compared to languages that run natively like C++ and C#. Since Java is relatively slow, we're not writing our video games in Java, not our robust ones that are going to be, 50 or 60 bucks that we're selling. You can write Angry Birds in Java. That's fine. No big deal. But in terms of a large industry, we're not writing video games in Java. Okay, so that's probably not the right tool for it. What kinds of applications might be written as platform-independent apps? For instance, if you're a software developer and you're writing a program, what kinds of programs might you decide it's worthwhile using Java, which is a little bit slower, so that I can make sure this runs on every single platform? What kinds of applications might those be? What about go ahead.
Like management software?
Okay. Management software, like a Microsoft Office type thing, that kind of stuff. What do you think? Should Microsoft Office be able to run on every single machine? Or is it most important it runs on Windows? We have several Mac users in here, right? Out of the Mac users, how many of you use Microsoft Office? How many of you use iWorks? Pages, numbers, and then if you need to send it to somebody as a .doc, you just export it as a Word document, right? Okay. Okay. So even though Microsoft Office is available for the Mac, many of us don't use it. Right? Okay. Those of you who are Windows users, how many of you do not use Microsoft Office? How many of you use OpenOffice? Okay. OpenOffice is kind of a good example from what we're talking about right here. OpenOffice is platform independent. So you can get OpenOffice for Windows, you can get OpenOffice on the Mac, you can get OpenOffice for Linux. And it'll work on all three. OpenOffice is a little bit more sluggish than Microsoft Office is natively. It actually launches pretty quickly. It probably launches quicker than Microsoft Office. I'm not even sure why that is. Microsoft Office must just do 1,000 different checks. It's probably checking your legal install key in triplicate before it to make sure you didn't steal the software, which I'm sure none of you did. Especially not now, because as a student, I think you can get Office for free. If you didn't know that, I'm pretty sure you can just go through. We can probably do it here in computer science, but also the campus has a site license. You can just get Microsoft Office for free on your machine. So maybe management, Office software, stuff like that might make sense in Java. But the reality is most Office environments are running Windows, right? It's not, if you went into 10 different businesses, probably at least 8 of them are going to have machines with Windows on them. Even as popular as Mac has gotten today. In the business world, most of the software that they need has been written in Windows. So even if you could have a word processor that would run on the Mac. Their 7 or 8 other applications that they use as part of their business are Windows only. So they're already running Windows. So even in that world, maybe not that big of a deal that software like that runs on both Mac and PC. Okay. In today's world, maybe Mac only has kind of a dominance in like graphics and video work. So if you went into 10 different multimedia or video shops, multimedia or art shops, maybe 8 out of 10 of them would be running Macs. So that's where the tables are flipped. But that's for a very specific domain. General businesses are going to all be running Windows, or a high percentage of them. Okay? Or if their owner happens to be a Mac fan, they'll have a Mac that's dual booting Windows in the Mac. Okay, because they'll need the Windows side of things for a lot of their applications. Okay, so we really still haven't answered. Go ahead.
Would it be internet providers, for instance, Chrome or Internet Explorer?
Okay. For who would use Java?
Yes, sir.
Okay, tell me more about that. Why?
Because I know certainly for Chrome you have a Mac download or a Windows download.
Okay.
Same with Safari and Firefox.
Okay, so your suspicion is that Chrome is written in Java because they offer it for both Mac and PC. Okay, not a bad suspicion. It's not. They're written natively for both platforms. So is Safari, and Internet Explorer will run on anything as long as it's Windows. So you get that punchline again. You're going to hear that a lot from the Microsoft side of the world. But hey, they earned their way to the top desktop, so be it. I always thought it was there was an interesting Microsoft lawsuit years ago that Microsoft lost, and I always thought it was just stupid. Somewhere in there they were able to bring it back, because I think if you install Windows now, it comes with Internet Explorer already on it, right? Okay. At some point, I remember what it was. At some point in the during the evolution of Windows, Microsoft was sued as a monopoly because they integrated Internet Explorer into the operating system, so you really had to use Internet Explorer. And I don't know who they was. I think it might have even just been the government sued Microsoft that they weren't allowed to include their own software on their own operating system because it created a monopoly around the internet. Because it forced people into using Internet Explorer rather than possibly choosing other browsers, or it made it so that using other browsers really hurt you from a productivity perspective in Windows. Doesn't that seem stupid? They wrote Windows and they wrote Internet Explorer. Shouldn't they be able to put their own software on their operating system? So the lawsuit was really about you guys have been too successful to continue to do this. I don't know. I always thought it was stupid, but whatever. Just another interesting backstory there, I guess. Okay, so platform independent apps. You might think things like Chrome and stuff like that might be platform independent, maybe written in Java. They're not. They're written natively in whatever language makes sense. So probably Chrome for the Mac is written in Objective-C. Chrome for the PC is written in C# or C++, something like that. And maybe even the evidence there is one of the things that Chrome stands behind is that they're supposed to be really, really, really fast, right? Chrome is a very lightweight web browser that has a lot of plugins that you can grab to add some additional functionality, but it's supposed to be really, really fast. Okay, so the second you hear something it has to be really, really fast, you're probably going to throw Java out of the running. And it's not because a normal human doesn't think Java's fast. It's just not as fast as other possible solutions. Okay, but now you were talking about web stuff. So where I was seeing where you were going with that is, how does Java play into the internet? Really, there's one major place where Java has a stronghold, and that's with stock investment companies. If any of you have ever traded or on the stock market or have seen somebody do it, when you go to like an E-Trade or an Ameritrade site and you're doing the stock market stuff, you can click this button. It will launch a professional level trading application out of your web browser as if it's installed in your computer. Okay? And that's something called a Java applet. Okay? Java applets are full Java applications that launch out of a web browser. Okay? Typically, when we go to a web page, what we're experiencing is static HTML pages, static content, or the dynamic content we might see requires us to click on something to go to another page because it's being processed on the back end by something like PHP. So we're clicking a button, it's sending a request out to the server, which is then sending us a new web page back that shows something new on the screen. Okay? So we wouldn't look at a web page and a native application as being equivalent products. Some things make sense in a web page, other things don't, right? So as an example, anybody in here use Google Docs for all of their paper writing and stuff? Okay, so when you're doing that, you're writing your stuff within a web browser, right? And maybe that's good enough for that type of application. Okay, but let's take it to the next step up. Let's say the application was a lot more complex than that. Can we pretty quickly find something that maybe doesn't make sense in a web browser? Sure. Web browsers serve a purpose, but they don't solve all problems. Where a Java applet comes in is it allows you to deliver a desktop experience, desktop application experience launched out of a web browser. And you can even detach it from the window so it's natively running on the screen. To give you an idea here, let's yeah, so here's E-Trade Pro. This will launch right out of your web browser. So you can kind of see it here. I mean, they have streaming video and stuff like this. Is like a legit tool for doing stock trading, and this is something that launches out of your web browser. Okay, so really, applets, I think, are the biggest reason Java has survived. Biggest reason Java has survived. Microsoft, in Microsoft fashion, did try to copy applets. You probably heard it by a couple different names. Maybe the older name would be COM. More recently, it's something called ActiveX. You ever been to a page that has an ActiveX control on it that you have to like agree to launch it or whatever? Or if you've ever been to a website that says this requires Internet Explorer to work? Okay, those are sites that have ActiveX controls on them, and the only web browser that supports ActiveX, because it relies on the .NET component architecture, is Internet Explorer. Okay, well, that becomes, first of all, a compatibility problem, right? Because we all use different web browsers, and so we're all technologists in here. Most of us in here are probably Windows users. How many of you use Internet Explorer as your primary browser? I saw no hands. Let's assume that nobody was not voting. But most of us are probably using something else. How many of you use Chrome? Several of you. How many of you use Firefox? Okay, several of you. If you're on PC, on the Windows side, I could offer you Safari, but I doubt many of you use Safari on Windows. Okay, for you Mac users, Safari very well might be your primary browser. Similarly, Chrome is very popular on Mac as well. My experience has been that Firefox is less popular for Mac users. No great reason, just but those might be our big three in web browsers, right? Certainly on the PC, it's kind of a competition between Chrome and Firefox. But the interesting truth is that Internet Explorer is actually the most popular web browser. Because we're technologists, we're people in the know. Well, Grandma, she double clicks on the big blue E when she wants to browse the internet, right? Because that's what the dude at Best Buy said to do. Okay, so a lot of people use Internet Explorer not because they don't know any better. And the reality is, it's not that Internet Explorer is crap. It's a very good browser, but we're right back to that whole argument we had either last class or the one before about, well, Windows has viruses, Mac doesn't. Well, a lot of those viruses take advantage of vulnerabilities that are on Internet Explorer. So it's got a gigantic target because every single Windows install has Internet Explorer on it, right? So that's guaranteed to be on everybody's machine. Might as well, if you're a virus writer, might as well take advantage of that and look for vulnerabilities. Okay, so it's not that Internet Explorer is innately crap. It's just got a big target on its back, and some of the other guys are able to learn some of the lessons that Internet Explorer had because it's been around for a long time. Once upon a time, there was a version of Internet Explorer for Mac that lasted, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks or something like that. Microsoft said, "Whoa, wait, what are we doing?" It was kind of crappy anyway, so maybe it was actually a strategy for people who wanted to have Internet Explorer because they needed to go to some websites that had Internet Explorer, that required Internet Explorer. They gave Macintosh people the option, but it was a bad product, so it makes them then go buy Windows and install another Macs. But whatever. So in any case, ActiveX controls are kind of Microsoft's competition with Applets, and it never held up. Applets by far are the kind of the bread and butter of Java, launching full-fledged applications from web browsers. Big deal. The other reason that I think that Java remained alive, because certainly Java did it way back when. Applets have been with Java since day one. So when Java first came out, it immediately had itself integrated into the HTML framework. There is a tag in HTML called Applet from HTML1, the very first HTML standard. So it supported it from day one. So don't you think that if they did it way back then, that somebody today could probably create at least the equivalent product using the .NET component architecture, using Mono, which is the non-Windows guesstimate of what the .NET component architecture is? Certainly. So applets are a big reason why it's still around, because a lot of people have written these applications in Java and we don't want to have to rewrite them. I think the other reason is Google. Okay? Now, the more recent evidence is all Google Android development is done in Java. Okay? But that's really more of the effect than the cause of what I'm about to explain here. So Google Android, all that development is done in Java, but Google is a Java shop. And maybe the better way of putting this is Google is a anything but Microsoft shop. They don't want to use Microsoft stuff unless they absolutely have to at Google. You ask Google, like, oh, we don't hate Microsoft. They hate Microsoft. Okay? They should. They're a major competitor, right? Google makes software. Google's they started in the search business. Does Microsoft have a search engine? Sure, Bing. Well, they're not. Are they going to be friends? No, that's a major competitor. Okay, Google is the big one. Bing is, any of you use Bing as your primary search engine? A couple people. Most of us probably still use Google. I've seen some Microsoft commercials that go out and they have people search for something in Bing, and it's like the results are so much better. I typically, whatever the browser's default is, that's what because I do all my searching through the URL. I just type it in there. But certainly both of them are viable search products, right? But Google's the king of search. Now Yahoo seems to be trying to regrow their search business or something. I don't know why Google or Microsoft. Well, actually I do. Google or Microsoft probably would buy them if it wasn't going to be blocked by the Trade Administration for another monopoly or something. But Google is a Java shop. So for years, Google has used Java internally at their business. So many of their applications are Java-based applications. Ones that aren't, Google typically uses scripting languages like Python. So these would be high-level, interpreted, general-purpose programming languages. So not one of our big three. Not one of these guys. All right, so Google probably kept Java relevant because they kept using Java because they didn't jump onto these bandwagons. Early on, Google and Apple were probably relatively good buddies. In fact, both of their boards had people, like Google's board had people from Apple on it, and Apple's board had people from Google on it. That's completely stopped now, and that really came out of the iOS versus Android wars. That was the fallout, kind of like we're talking about Star Wars. It's like, they were having to recuse themselves from too many meetings when the Apple board was talking about iOS stuff, the iPhone software. The Android people weren't allowed to be in the room because that was a competitor and vice versa. I'm not sure that it's fair to say that Google hates Apple, but I would say generally speaking, Apple, at least Steve Jobs, who's not with us anymore, but he certainly doesn't like Google. He, in his biography, he thought Google stole iOS. Basically, Android is a stolen version of iOS, but whatever. We need them both. It makes us, we benefit as consumers. So anyways, that's the story with Java. So Java's platform independent stuff, Android stuff, web applications launching out of web browsers, and Google kept them afloat. C# is all native Windows stuff. I guess we could throw Windows Phone in here. If you're doing writing apps for Windows Phone, which has a whopping, I don't know what, 0.01% of the... Any of you in here have a Windows Phone? Who wants to admit it? Actually, I have several friends who have Windows Phones. They're actually quite happy with them. I think maybe just Microsoft is just a little bit too late to that party. It's kind of like you got these two giants with iOS and Android taking 99.97% of the smartphone market, and not a whole lot of room for somebody else to squeeze in there. But certainly you can write Windows Phone apps using C# or any of the .NET languages. And then Objective-C is all Mac stuff. If Apple makes it, Objective-C is the language. There's a new language that Apple announced last year. Anybody know the name of it? Swift, yeah. So they're trying to get some people to move over to this language called Swift. I'm debating, I teach our special topics class here, which is CSC200. I'm debating maybe doing that on Swift in the fall. If you end up liking this programming stuff and want to take a look at that. I think the idea of Swift is it's supposed to be an easier language to program in, but not based off of like these older languages like C and C++. So it's kind of Apple trying to reinvent the programming language paradigm through this new language. So we'll see if it takes off or not, but it'll at least be interesting to look at. Okay, and then PHP is web stuff. Questions about any of that? All right, so we're back to this slide that we wrote several classes ago. Two types of programming languages, loosely typed and strongly typed. So loosely typed languages do not require us to define what kind of value is being held in a variable. Strongly typed languages do require us to say what kind of value is defined, is a variable was built to hold. Okay. Now remember, way back to our beginning, we were talking about how human beings solve problems. We use our memory, we ask questions, and we do repetition. Then we talked about what programming languages are attempting to do. They're attempting to mimic the way human beings solve problems. So that means they mimic memory through something called variables. They mimic asking questions through something called conditionals. They mimic repetition through something called loops. All right? So when we talk about variables from a programming language perspective, what we're really talking about is how a programming language mimics us remembering things. Okay? So variables are named containers for holding values. Loosely typed languages do not require us to define what kind of value. Strongly typed languages do require us to define what kind of values. Okay, so when we build that container, when we build that named container that's built to hold something in our memory, loosely typed languages don't require us to put a sticker on it saying what's this made for. Okay, strongly typed languages do. Okay, so a loosely typed language would be like going out and buying one of those big Tupperware things at Target that you can throw clothes in it, you can throw shoes in it, you can whatever you want to put in there you can. A strongly typed language would be kind of like buying a. I probably have to go to like an older video game console. Let's go like original Nintendo. So you get original Nintendo. Only Nintendo cartridges fit in that slot. So that named the slot for the game slot. Let's just say that was the name of it. Only fits a certain kind of value, and that is a Nintendo cartridge. Right? Okay. Define. There we go. See, those are the old video game scams. Now, what do? We download the game and burn it to disk and modify our machines so that they can, they read it as if it's a native disk, right? In the early days, people would go to these stores and buy their Nintendo cartridges, open them up, take the chip out, little chip, and then return the cartridge without the chip in it, hoping that the target person, or actually I don't even know if Target existed then, but hoping that the person wouldn't check. They're looking inside there for the actual motherboard, the chip that has it on. So then somebody would just have a pile of chips, and then they would have their own generic game cartridge, like maybe they had their Super Mario Brothers game cartridge, and they could just swap chips in and out, and that's the game they were playing. See, over time, these new technologies have just made it more and more convenient for us to steal, right? We don't even have to get dressed now to steal a video game. Ay. Oh, and even like I know there's tools now for they've made it almost paint by number for modding systems. I know the video game mod for the Nintendo Wii, the original Wii, which tried to detect that it was a disc certified by Nintendo or something. The mod for it was like this little, it was a little chip, and you'd put it on there, and it had 3 holes. And what you had to do is you had to line those holes up with these spots, and you soldered into each of those 3 holes. And all it did was connect a wire from right before the check to right after the check, bypassing the check. So every disc was viewed as an accurate disc because it didn't go through that little check sensor or whatever. So we've gotten a lot more complex today. But yeah, before we just stole the chip right out of the game. It would be the equivalent today of returning a Xbox game with just the package without the disc in it. They'll notice pretty quick to do that. All right, so variables. Named containers, a named contained container for holding values. Loosely typed do not require us to say what kind. Strongly typed do require us to say what kind. And to give us the syntax for a variable, the generic syntax for a variable in a strongly typed language is type variable name equals value. So that would be like in a language like Java, C++, C#, those types of languages. So what's a type? We just start this thing here. Okay, so we'll pick up on types next class. I don't know. We might have a quiz next class over something we talked about today. Make sure you study it. I'll see everybody on Friday.